Hello everybody, and welcome back. I'm here for my second stream. I apologize, I had a technical glitch on the last attempt at this, but I think I have my audio back. Alright, so with no further ado, let's get back into Natron. Alright, so here we are, we're back into Natron this time. And as we can see, I have my waveform editor. I should say I have my waveform up alongside the color bar. Now, I've already preset this to a display gamma of 1. And the reason that I've set that is because I said in the last video that Natron works in a display gamma of 1, linear color space. Okay. By default, Windows and Mac and all different ones have different display gammas. But the waveform by default is set to 2.2. So what 2.2, if we look at this, we can see that this here, where we should have a linear gradient going across, we actually wind up with a curve going across. And we don't want it to be a curve, so we want to set this back to a display gamma of 1. Now, as we can see, we have a linear line going across. This linear line represents this gradient going across here. So, that tells us that this is working in a linear color space. Okay? Now, well, this is showing us what our linear color space is and what our adjustments are in linear color space. Our viewer node over here is set to sRGB. If we set this to linear, things look a little weird. It gets all funky. And it's not very apparent right now because what's going on there. Because we're used to seeing everything in linear, or excuse me, in 2.2 color space, or color gamma, I should say. What we're going to do is we're going to move this aside, and we're going to add a constant. And, whoops, I didn't want to disconnect it. I want to set my constant so that it has an alpha of 1, because when I overlay certain things like an SE noise, I don't want the SE noise, it won't show if there's no alpha. Some of the other nodes will also do this. So always, if you use a constant, make sure that you set it, even when it's black, set it so that the alpha is 1. Okay? So the first thing we're going to do is put a ramp in here, because a ramp is the easiest way to see what's going on with the waveform and with the various types of display gamma. So we're going to put a ramp in, hit tab, type in ramp, puts in a ramp. Now our ramp has 2 points. It has a 0.0 and a 0.1, and we can adjust these over here in our controls. For 0.0, we're going to set the X value to 0 and set the Y value to also 0, because we don't need any height for what we're going to be doing. Then for 0.1, I'm going to be setting the 0.1, because this is by Natron by default, at least, yes, by default, if you download it, you can change this, by the way. By default, it creates a new project at HD resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. So we're going to set our X to the maximum, which is 1920. And then I'm going to set my Y to 0 as well. That will give us a perfect linear gradient going from the left side of our screen to the right side of our screen. except that there's a problem here. When we're looking at this, this doesn't look linear to us. This looks it looks dark here, but it looks kind of white over on the right-hand side. And while it looks this way here, we can tell from our waveform that it's actually a linear gradient. It's going from black over on the left to white on the right. Okay? So what's going on here? Why does it look different? And it's because this is in sRGB. sRGB, it's applying a gamma of 2.2 to our viewer, which is what we want most of the time if we're just using it for computers. If we're making something that's going to display on the internet or on locally on our computers, 2.2 is usually what we want to use. If we, sRGB is what we want to use. If we want to make something for video, a lot of times there's all different types of color spaces, and I'll make an episode talking about various color spaces and what exactly a color space is. But Rec 709 is considered the standard HD color space. So if we want to work in Rec 709, we would switch to Rec 709. But as I said, internally, Natron works in a linear color space. So what we're going to do here is we're going to switch this to linear. And now what we see is this line is linear going across here. And over here, it looks linear going across. Well, that's interesting. I wonder why that is. Well, it has to do with the fact they're both operating in the same color space, even though we're on a system that supports a 2.2 gamma. It is working in linear. It's displaying it correctly because, well, that's how the interface was designed. So, but what we want to do here, we want to go back to sRGB. When we're in sRGB, this is how, if we load it in a JPEG, it would look correctly. This is how a linear ramp actually would look, which doesn't look quite right. So what does this mean? How do we fix this here? Well, it turns out under the ramp options, we have a bunch of types here. And the second one down is this thing called P-linear. And P-linear stands for perceptually linear. What that means is that it's going to counter our display gamma with a curve. So if I select that, we can see that it bows in the opposite direction. So a 2.2 display gamma would go in the opposite direction. So now we're winding up, excuse me, this is a 2.2 gamma. So you can see it's spending more time in the blacks, and then it goes up more rapidly as it gets over to the whites. It has to do with how computers see color and light, or I should say luminance tones, and how our eyes perceive it. We see things in a logarithmic scale, and the computer does not. Well, I should say we see it. Well, anyway, so what we're going to do, so we can see here that this is a linear ramp, or at least it looks linear, or it looks more linear because it's perceptually linear. Okay, and when we switch back to linear and we go to linear view, we wind up with something that looks very, very similar. So this is how Natron sees it, and this is how we see it. Okay. Now below this, we can also see that there's an option to have ease in. For ease in, if we look at the ramp, or at our waveform, we can see that the value comes in and it starts off and it eases in, and then it sort of levels off into a linear line until it gets to our whitest point. And so that's what's happening over here. It starts off dark, and then it gradually turns into a linear line. Now, it doesn't look like it's necessarily doing that over here, but it is. And if we were to use this to create something, use this to create a texture map for something, say like Blender or some form of 3D viewing, this would create something that would look like a ramp, a slope that goes up and just continues up in a linear line. So if we go to ease out, we wind up with something that we had in the last video. We did an animation, and the animation started off linear, and it went up, and then it eased out into and leveled off as it got up to the top. And that's what's happening here. It's going in a linear form, and then as it gets close to the top, it eases into the white. And so this would create something that looks kind of like almost not quite like a pyramid, because that's what we would have gotten with a straight linear slope. This would give us something that looks like a pyramid at the bottom, but it's been worn away with time as it gets to the top, as if something has eroded it or something. And if we go to smooth, we wind up with an S-curve. And an S-curve means that it eases in from the bottom and it eases out at the top. And so we wind up with this nice gradual smooth curve like a hill. And this is this is visible inside of our radial node by default. So we're going to pull up a radial node. So I'm going to type in radial. A radial is basically a type of sphere. It's an ovaloid is the proper term for it, because it's not just a sphere, it's oval by default. And we can change a lot of factors about this, but we really are curious to see the slope of our sphere. And I'm actually going to change this so that by default, as we said, this is 1920 by 1080. We're going to turn it so that it's got uniform scale, because we want to turn this into a circle. So, because we're going to try and turn this into something that looks more like a sphere, at least from the viewer's perspective. So I'm going to click on this 2, which is going to turn this. It's going to link the 2, and it's too big by default. It's 1920, which is the width of our view. We want to change it so that it's 1080, because that's a height. So 1080. And it's not centered, so we're going to click on center to center it. And now we can see it a little bit better. Now, we can still see the S-curve here, but it's a lot steeper in our waveform. That doesn't really matter that much. It produces the same effect. What we're going to try and do, if we were to try and make this look like a sphere, right now, we won't wind up with a sphere. We're going to wind up with something that looks like a hill. And in fact, let's actually do this. I didn't do this in the last version of this. I'm going to do this. It took me a while. And I'm going to just go into I'm going to look up the croc emboss, which I went looking for last time. We're just going to type in emboss, which brings up the community croc emboss texture. And when we do this, this is displaying our slope, or our radial, as if it were a bump map. From if you were to view this in Blender as a texture map, or in any 3D program as a texture map, this is the equivalent of looking at it as a bump. And this can be actually quite useful. We can use this for sculpting our text. And I might show, or I'll guarantee I'll show, we're going to make at a future point a chiseled font, and that's pretty cool. We can use this to create chiseled fonts and all kinds of really interesting things inside of Natron without having to go outside of Natron. We can do it right in here with this node, and by adjusting how our waveform, or how our slopes from dark to light transition. So for right now, what we're going to do is we're looking at this. As we can see, it starts off slow and it ramps up as an S-curve, and we wind up with something that looks more like a hill. We have a couple problems with our emboss here. One of the first things that we see is we have this funky little white line going over here, and that has to do with the fact that our view height is too is too high. If we just take it down to -1, it eliminates that. That's the first thing. And we have a really hard shadow. Now, we're not going to worry too much about that hard shadow. That has to do with how high. This height is our view height, our viewer's height. As we raise it, it pulls us away, but it also, I should say, excuse me, this isn't our viewer height. This is the height of of how high it is bringing up the mountain, or as we'll call it in this case, it's increasing the highest point of this. So as I bring this up, you can see that it makes our mountain brighter, or our hill brighter. And if I bring it down, it lowers it. Okay, let's set it back to its default of 20. And then this is our light height, which determines how high in the sky above this it is. And if the higher we go, the less of a shadow we have. And it will actually help to perceive this more as a whole unit. Right now we're starting to see this more as a whole curve. We're seeing depth to it. We get a little bit of a shadow as if the light is coming in from the side, and that has to do with the light position offset over here. So right now this does not look like a sphere. It looks, soft. It comes in soft, then it kind of ramps up, and then we have a bump over on the side. Well, it doesn't look like a spheroid. We want to make this look like a sphere, so we're going to move this up a little bit so that we have space. And the first thing we're going to use is, I'm going to just pull this crock and boss out of here for a minute. I'm going to pull in a linear to log function. Now, linear to log creates a ramp. Let's do there it is. Or log to linear, linear to log. It does both, okay? And by default, you can see that it comes in and it goes very, very rapidly up. Very rapidly up. And if we were to actually, let's just for a second, I didn't do this the last time. I'm going to rehook our ramp in here just so we can look at the slope. We can see this is creating a type of a gamma curve. And if we pull it off to the right, this is a controlled gamma curve. So we can get it to slope off to the right, very much like our gamma. In fact, this has gamma to it. And if we can pull the other side to adjust where our black level is. So we can go to the other direction, back and forth. Let's reset this to default. And let's bring this down. Actually, let's reset it to default and connect it back up to our radial. So I'm disconnecting the ramp, connecting back to my radial. And I'm going to grab the white point and I'm going to bring it up because I want to bring down our sphere. And we can see that right now we're winding up with something that goes very rapidly up, very much like a mountain top. But we don't want to do that. We want to have the opposite. We want it to start off round at the top and come down kind of sharp at the bottom, so it's more like a sphere. So we're going to actually switch this from log to linear to log, which does the opposite. Now it's applying the curve in the opposite direction. And we are seeing over here that it's gray over here, and that's because our black point is at 95. So this gray is because our black point is at 95. If we take our black point down to 0, bam, we wound up with something that looks a lot more like a sphere. Except for, as we can see up here, it's not perfectly spherical. It looks it's like a deformed sphere. It has to do with the way the function works. So let's see how this looks when we apply it to the emboss. If we just treat this as if it were a sphere, we wind up with something that looks pretty good, except for I don't know if this is going to show up very well. But let's take our light height and we're going to adjust it up and down. And right here we start to see that there's I gotta pull it back again. This has to do with the fact that I have auto turbo, so it drops the resolution a little bit. I'm going to actually just manually pull this down And you can see there's this little dimple that's happening here. And that has to do with this isn't a perfect way to get a nice, perfect, sculpted, we can't get a perfectly sculpted spheroid shape using the log to linear. But it is a quick way to get something that is spheroid shaped. And if you're in a rush, it's quick, it can work. You can get something that functions, and in a lot of programs that will work. So there is something that's offers us even more control, which is the lookup table. Now, the lookup table draws very, very slowly, a lot slower than the log to linear and linear to log function. But we have a whole lot more control over the overall shape of our gradient. And again, this is sculpting. We're using this to look at how our shape is getting sculpted. So I'm going to, again, disconnect our croc and boss for a minute while we connect up our lookup table. And I'm just going to type in lookup, and it says color lookup. It's found in our color options. It's a default plugin for Natron. If we go up here, I'll show you in here. It is right here, color lookup. Okay. And what we're going to be doing, we're not going to mess with anything but the master because we don't need anything more than that. So the black here represents the black in our image. The white here represents the white in our image. If I add a point in here, I can sculpt the shape of our node. So I'll just add a point. And watch what happens as I drag this around. We start to sculpt our shape. And as I push this up, you'll notice that it starts to sculpt it, and it even overshoots it and then comes back down, and we wind up with this cavity. Now, the reason we don't see the cavity really up here on our in our view up here is because well, we actually are. It does. If I push this up high enough, it will likely no, it's just overshooting. Oh, I take it back. What is happening is it's going past white. We're not actually seeing it because we're not pulling it down, but it's actually there. It will affect things, and it's because we have not clamped this. And this will become evident in a few minutes. Actually, let's show that right now. If I pull this over to the side here, we're going to start seeing some weird things when we pipe this into our croc and boss. Okay, it looks pretty good right now. We got something that looks kind of sphere-like over here, but when we pump it into our croc and boss, we get this weirdness happening over here. It gets all gray here, and what's happening is once it passes 0, it starts going in the opposite direction, or at least that's the way I see it. It seems like it goes back and it sort of rings. It goes back past it, and then it says, oh, I'm rounding it back up, and it goes back up towards 1. And so even though this is a negative number, Natron's inverting that negative, and so it goes into a positive until it passes a certain point, and then it comes back down, and we wind up with this weird, interesting ringy pattern, which is kind of cool, but we don't really want that on the outside. What we want to do here on our lookup is we want to clamp our black. Okay, and by clamping our black, it tells it that when it gets to black, don't process this node anything below this point any further. Okay, all right. So now, obviously, we have a problem. We have a divot up here. It doesn't look very interesting over here. But when I bring this back down, I can wind up with something that looks a lot more kind of sphere-like. It's really hard to judge at this point from here where we have it running through a croc node, the croc and boss, what our actual shape is. So I recommend not doing this until we get it. As we can see, that's not very round. All right, so I'm going to pull this around and try and get it so that it looks a little more like a sphere. And really what I wanted to do is at the end here, down here, I want it to be almost vertical. So I want to pull this in so it's more like that. But the problem we have is that it's overshooting way up here. So we need to obviously add a point somewhere in here, and it's giving me a little bit of lip right now. So there we go. All right, so here we go. We got something up here, and then over here we can drag this around until we get something that looks more vertical, and then we go over here, and wow, things get weird and wonky. But fortunately, we can adjust these things by just dragging on them and sculpting them until we get something that fits what we want a bit more. And I won't say we're going to get something perfectly round, but we will get something a lot closer. Yay! You guys can hear me. I'm glad you can hear me. All right, I'm going to just bring this back in a little bit. And all right. I'm just looking at that waveform, trying to get it a little more, hopefully roundish. I don't know if I like this point here, so I'm going to delete it. I'm going to pull this over like that, down, get it so it's really rounded up here. The dark areas, it doesn't usually matter as much. All right, let's try and run this shape through our crock and boss, and we wind up with something that should look a bit more like a spheroid if we adjust it correctly. We can raise our light height and our view height, adjust our view a bit more. It's looking okay. But the goal of this was to teach you guys that you can use this to reshape your nodes and sculpt things, sculpt shapes, and then you can adjust these and turn them into something more than what they were. Again, the goal of these is supposed to introduce you to concepts and things about Natron that you might not be familiar with, and not to go into in-depth tutorials. I'm going to open this up to questions. We're hitting the half-hour mark at this point, so I'm going to open this up to questions on the forum. If anybody wants to ask some questions, I will happily do it, but I'm going to stop the actual... actually, unless people want me to continue. Do people want me to continue? Why doesn't somebody post? I'm reading the comments right now. Do people want me to continue, or do we want to discuss this at a later point? Alright, I'm going to just end it here. So, let's put this back to this. And everybody, have a great day, and I'll catch you later. And keep staying with your Natron.